Hello there everyone. Today I shall make a video discussing the New Deal and how a lot of people call it the Golden Age of Capitalism. More specifically, there's a time period known as the Golden Age of Capitalism. It's a very real thing. However, a lot of people blame the New Deal on it. People look at the Golden Age of Capitalism. I just make it an actual G. And they say that the New Deal led up to that and caused it. I disagree for a number of reasons. I'll go into them. And, as a cheers, a good Coke. Good symbol of Americana for a very important subject. Now, for starters, let's look at unemployment, since a lot of this won't mean anything without numbers, because it's easy to say, oh, well, it could have been a number of things that caused the Golden Age of Capitalism, but first we need to discredit the idea that the New Deal caused it. So, let's look at unemployment. So let's say 0% unemployment's here, and what's the highest? That's reasonable. According to my graph, 30% will be our high mark. So, no freak. So I did look up a graph. It's on, I don't actually know exactly what it is, but it seems to line up with a table on ResearchGate, which is apparently a reliable website. I'm not certain, but on ResearchGate there is a table, and it has the unemployment percentages alongside the natural rate of unemployment for each year. It's by Brian Snowdon, and it's US GDP prices and unemployment. So I will use that as a baseline, and it was graphed by someone else, so I'll use that as a metric. So we start here, 1929. And we'll end, let's do 1941. This is right before the war, so it's worth keeping in mind, Lend-Lease is already in effect by 1941. The US was already involved in the war, just not fighting with troops. So, let's take a look. So, going from about... Tell you what, I'll just skip this and you can watch the lines later. Bit shameful, it took me too long to realize that it'd be easy if I just wrote the 30s separately, since we already know it's the 1900s, because it's the Great Depression, but hey, what can you do? So, let's split further and go 10, 5, 20, 25. So using these numbers, we can plot out a graph, and I'll just skip this so you don't have to worry about it to make it easier, but I'm going to plot out based on the graph I'm given and the table what unemployment was versus the estimated natural rate. Okay, now these bubbles that I have drawn, those are the average, well, not average, they are the natural rates of unemployment. So basically, these are what would be expected under normal circumstances. As you can see, it's sitting around 5%. In truth, it's 4.5 to 4.8%, but putting it at 5% makes it easier to read, so that should do. Next, I'm going to graph the actual unemployment rates throughout the years. So, let's get it. Okay, I have drawn the unemployment percentages roughly, so it's not going to be precise, but it should at least demonstrate what's going on. For one, unemployment never got lower than the natural rate, or even tied with it, throughout the entirety of the New Deal era and the Depression. Now, the reason why I wouldn't advise including 1941 in this graph, if we're looking at purely the New Deal, is because of World War II. Lend-Lease is already pushing it just due to the nature of the fact that it was so much material that had to be purchased and then shipped off. But it's a whole nother deal when you are part of the war machine, and the U.S. went massively into the war machine. Now one might ask, what was the highest unemployment percentage? That would be 25.2% here. This other spike that occurred in 1938 is 19.1%. Now, it's not exact because, again, I am very bad at drawing graphs, so this isn't actual relative distance, but you can see it starts to dip. In fact, the lowest it got before it went down again was 14.3 in 1937. So it got to here, and then it went back up. Now, when did FDR get in charge? Right here. So if we want to look at the New Deal, let's look at FDR here. Now, it's worth noting, a lot of what FDR did, Herbert Hoover also tried to employ. He tried to raise prices, cartelize industries, add regulations. Basically, he tried to set up similar systems to the New Deal. He just, in the minds of many people, didn't go far enough, which is why FDR was elected. In fact, FDR himself actually did his best to portray Hoover as if he didn't do anything, or at the very least didn't do much. And that's why we have the reputation of Hoover today as the laissez-faire one who didn't really do much. He did a lot. A lot of bad things, I won't deny. But he did a lot. Including, among other things, raising tariffs, kicking out Mexicans, and starting a bunch of extra regulations on businesses trying to keep prices high. It didn't work, but he tried. So here's what I highlight and why I bring up unemployment statistics. Now, what was the goal of the New Deal? To kickstart the economy, for one. But how did they want to do that? They wanted to get people jobs. With the Herculean effort that FDR went into, especially with his programs at the 36 on, once they got the courts out of the way, and the courts no longer were worried about FDR, you would expect these numbers to fall below natural levels because everyone was trying to get shoved into work. Heck, we established a city in Alaska just to get farmers back into work. You might have heard of it. It's called Palmer. It was initially founded as a colony by FDR and the New Dealers as an attempt to get farmers back to work by working land in Alaska. Instead, what we see is the unemployment rate slowly goes down and then rises up again. Now, this would be bad for a number of reasons. With a fall as complete as the Depression, you'd expect that unemployment would go down far faster, especially if the New Deal helped. Because if we were to take this like a bell curve, we should expect it to go up and then down. Instead, what we see is it goes up, lingers for a bit, and then eventually collapses around the time of World War II. World War II is what really got us out of the Depression. Furthermore, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why this is. So this is just data that shows FDR did not get people out of the job as he wanted. But rationalism can also explain a lot of this. For one, consider his tax hikes. If you're a person working, why work when what you take home won't be as much as before? Sure, you still need to eat, but there's a very real question of why work when, especially thanks to a bunch of government programs, you can be taken care of. Now, it's not ideal, but tax hikes have been shown to lower productivity and investment. This is why, for example, with John Maynard Keynes, the economist who advocated similar policies to Roosevelt, he advised not raising taxes during a recession. In fact, he argued the opposite, that one should cut taxes and raise spending because by doing so, you stimulate the economy even further. He essentially argued that the deficits one sustains during a recession can be tolerated because the state is the way it is. And so, by lowering taxes and increasing social payments, you rejuvenate the economy, revive it, and thus you get an era of prosperity, which can then be taxed with social spending being reduced to effectively flatten the curve on both ends, thus preventing debt from being too much of a problem, while simultaneously social spending and taxes can effectively be used to mitigate any potential flaws in a boom or a bust. In fact, Maynard Keynes and FDR did have an encounter, and Keynes did not like him. Now, granted, I don't like Keynes either, but even still, you can't deny it is a bit funny when the economist who specializes in this type of spending and belief system does not like you. Because FDR was far more on the looking like he was doing something rather than actually doing something. And as such, the tax hikes were a major problem. Now, to commend FDR and his policies, lower tariffs was a good idea. We have to remember, the reason the farms got to such a point with the Dust Bowl is one, because of overfarming, but why were they overfarming? It's because they wanted to export food to Europe. If you look at what happened in the World Wars, a lot of Europe's population was drafted for the war, and then they were sent back home and eventually tried to find work in the factories. Europe wasn't doing as much farming anymore, especially because a lot of areas, especially in France and Germany, were torched. So American farmers thought this was a good time to get some debt, invest in new farming equipment and farming practices, and mass-produce food to ship it out to Europe. And it's not a bad plan, all things considered, but it was Hoover's tariffs that caused a massive downward spiral for them. Because here they were, investing all of this to build up their farms, and then, what did they do? They encouraged people to buy locally, or sell locally. That wasn't the problem. They had overproduced already, and now they couldn't sell that overproduced food and supplies to other people. That was going to drive down prices to such a point that no one could sustain it, especially when people involved were taking out debt to do it. And since that overproduction overworked the land, as one can imagine, Dust Bowl comes in, wrecks the farms. So, this, I will solidly say, good policy, this definitely not. What about the New Deal's other policies? Looking strictly at rationalism, because I can't pull up data right now. Well, what about his cartels? Those were horrible ideas. They reduced production. See, there are a lot of price-fixing scams, or rather just works to fix prices under the New Deal. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, along with several others in many different industries, attempted to try to control production with the hope of raising prices. Here's the issue. In doing so, that meant less production and so less employees getting hired. Furthermore, the harder it is to purchase things, the less someone working for lower wages is going to be able to afford. Meaning, a business either needs to pay more, which they just started a recession and it's now a depression. Do you think they can afford to hire more workers? It's unlikely. And more than that, it also meant that all those increases in exports, which should be happening from the lower tariffs, aren't happening as much as they should, because all the things they were going to export aren't being produced because the cartels are lowering production. For example, the Agricultural Adjustment Act included several things involving subsidies for not farming food and people turning over food to be destroyed so that it wasn't sold, thus reducing the amount of production and therefore reducing the amount of supply. Increased demand or same demand allows for raising prices, and they hoped that would help the economy. Did not. The other problem with his constant overbearing on the economy was mass regulation. This is a problem for the same reason that the cartels are a problem. It lowers production. Well, actually, it lowers everything at a time when it was needed least. See, a minimum wage sounds great on paper, but would you rather have a cent a day getting paid for work, or no job and no payment? I'd still take the cent a day, because at least that means I'm getting employed and I can try to make ends meet. It would be difficult, if not starvation, but I can try. And that's the thing. Normally what happens when there's a depression like this, wages get cut, a few people get fired, things go bad, and then they recover within a year or two. We actually saw this in the 1920s earlier on, during basically what one might call the lazy phase. During the Roaring Twenties, there was a push away from progressive politics and towards basically just sitting on our laurels, enjoying what we had, and just having a laissez-faire action. Part of that was when a recession occurred in the 20s, the president at the time, I'm going to look up his name. Okay, it was Warren Harding. I was wondering if it was him at Coolidge. It was Harding in the 1920s recession. And it only lasted a year. It was a massive drop and involved an increase in unemployment by 8% from 4 to 12 and a drop in production by 31%. It was a massive depression, yet we don't see the same as what we have with the Great Depression with both Hoover and FDR, because what Harding did was he dropped taxes, just let things grow back, and what ended up happening? They grew back. Notice how I said the recession lasted a year, 1920 to 1921. In 1 year, we recovered from an 8% rise in unemployment. That should say a lot already. See, there's a problem with attempting to regulate your way out of a recession. A recession is not something that can be regulated away because it is, by its nature, a man-made thing. And so you need man to fix it. The best way to do that is for people to say, okay, that was a mistake, we'll correct, and we'll move on. A lot of businesses do this naturally with recessions. They'll cut wages, they'll cut employment to a smaller degree, and they'll hold on to what they can, and from there, they'll basically ride out the lower prices, and eventually, when things return back to normal, they raise wages, rehire people, and basically try to gain what market share they can in the aftermath. That right there is already a massive difference from what FDR tried to do. He tried to raise wages through minimum wage and through state competition with worker programs. Simultaneously, he sought to lower competition and all these fed a bad business environment. With less competition and higher wages, less businesses would be able to hire, and so less people would get employed. Thus, this was prolonged until there was such an increase in demand by the war that the economy was able to jumpstart again. In truth, this is when the Depression started to end. It's also worth noting, a lot of people blame deflation for this, and I could go into a whole thing on why that's wrong too. But, needless to say, forced inflation is not good. And FDR tried to do that. He tried to the best of his abilities, lower the costs for hiring people by increasing inflation. But it didn't work. Deflation can work, and it actually did work throughout the Gilded Age, making a lot of things cheaper. Hardly the best time, but still. It did help, and it lasted for a good period without pulling a depression. Well, a Great Depression. There were plenty of recessions during the Gilded Age, but they weren't as bad, and they lasted far shorter. Because with everything as low as it was in prices, it was easy to hire someone, because you didn't have to pay them that much, And it was easy to buy things because prices weren't that high, because the Gilded Age left a lot of things very cheap, thus allowing the economy to restart far faster. What we have here is the perfect storm of things not going well. You try to raise prices through both inflation and minimum wages, but people don't have the money to spend, so they end up relying on government assistance while simultaneously not getting a job because people don't want to hire them. Cartels lower production, so you're not getting many exports, and many regulations make it harder to get into business, thus reducing production that way, so cartels are going to stay. And then finally, raising taxes means less money overall, and so the depression is prolonged. In truth, all evidence points to depression being prolonged by FDR, not shortened. Now, was FDR charismatic? Yes. In fact, if someone like him had an understanding of economics, like we had FDR's economics, but an economist's understanding of how the economy works, then the depression would have been over far sooner. The issue is, we just had FDR, and he knew policies that sounded good, but that weren't good in practice. However, I still respect him as a leader during the war. But the true cause of the Golden Age of Capitalism is two things. Now that we've established it wasn't that, what could it be? Well, two things. World War II and the Marshall Plan. These are the true causes of the Golden Age of Capitalism. See, the United States, after World War II, was basically the only power that wasn't bombed to oblivion. Every other power had significant industrial reductions due to bombing raids and a lot of wars. Plus, they lost a lot of their population, especially in Asia. My lord, China and Japan. Oh boy. And the Soviets were even worse on that front. Both all that loss of life and industrial slowdowns, naturally speaking, once the transition from a war to a civilian economy came to, a lot of these countries struggled. So, the US was left in a very prime position. Because we had all our industry from the pre-Depression era, it just wasn't being used. During the war, it started being used and a bunch of things started being produced, which we were exporting both to our troops and to our allies. As a result, the US economy saw a massive drop in unemployment, which my graph doesn't show, but it starts right here and keeps going lower. All the while, GDP went up because everyone was trading with us. And so, the US ended up at the center of the new economic world, in particular, the capitalist world. The Soviets controlled the communist forces, but beyond that, the US controlled the rest. But why is the Marshall Plan so important? Well, due to it, and the adoption of it, we saw Europe's rapid recovery using the US to do so, granting both US and European companies a big benefit. They were thus able to rapidly rebuild their societies and their infrastructure, allowing for a post-war economic boom that would last all the way up until the 70s. It was these two that really brought both the US and later the global economy to a boom, to what can truly be called a golden age, because the US was left without competition, really. If we wanted to, we could have steamrolled the Soviets. We had the industrial capability to do so. However, because of how we played with World War II and how we decided to develop in the post-war world, what we ended up seeing happening was Europe, Asia, in particular Japan, and numerous other areas were seeing rapid development because of the United States. In particular, our allies, either those who joined NATO or those who were anti-communist for whatever reason, saw investments by the United States. Japan's economic miracle was only possible because of U.S. trade. Simultaneously, the Asian tigers could really only develop thanks to the global economy set up as a result of the Marshall Plan and U.S. attempts to lower tariffs across the board and increase free trade. We also saw with the lowering of taxes under later administrations an opening up of trade possibilities and buying power for average citizens. As a result, a golden age truly emerged. Because we have to remember, these tax hikes of FDR's were cut down by more than just Reagan. We see tax cuts from pretty much every president after him. I think maybe Truman didn't, but Truman's main focus was just consolidating the freaking code because FDR made it way more complicated than it needed to be. But thanks to Truman and his Marshall Plan, well, I say his Marshall Plan, it was one of his allies in the presidency. George Marshall, I believe, was the name. But thanks to adopting his plan and the redevelopment of Western Europe, Europe was back on its feet and could trade again, thus increasing economic productivity across the area, thus meaning more trade for the U.S., thus leading to the U.S. gaining more jobs through trade, thus leading to the U.S. economy growing. And so the cycle grew, as everyone built off each other until eventually we saw a true, shall we say, epoch, true peak of capitalist development. It's only in the 70s when these things started to catch up to us, where other countries started developing far more efficiently than the U.S., that we see the U.S. now with competition again from Europe, Asia, and later the Middle East, thanks to oil. And so if you want to thank anyone for the Golden Age of Capitalism, thank Truman. Or thank Hitler for giving us a good reason to produce a bunch of guns. Whatever you want to say. But you can't thank FDR because that'd be a bold-faced freaking lie. Anyways, have a good day. And enjoy the rest of yours. See ya.